Imagine a monarch so grotesquely malformed that his own subjects whispered he was touched by the devil himself. This was Charles II of Spain, a ruler whose very existence seemed to defy nature. Known as El Hechizado, the Bewitched, his appearance shocked even the most seasoned courtiers of Europe's mightiest empire. Yet the true horror wasn't some supernatural curse. It was something far darker, lurking in the very blood that coursed through his veins. This is the chilling saga of how the Habsburg dynasty, obsessed with power, wove a genetic nightmare that birthed a king whose body and mind crumbled under the weight of their ambition. Buckle up, because the shocking secrets of royal power are about to unravel. Charles's story begins with a jaw that refused to close, a grotesque hallmark of his lineage. When foreign envoys first laid eyes on him, they struggled to conceal their dismay. Here was the sovereign of Spain, ruler of a sprawling empire, yet his lower jaw jutted so far forward that his lips could never meet. His mouth hung open, a gaping flaw that no royal title could hide. This wasn't a mere quirk of birth. It was the grim outcome of 2 centuries of the Habsburgs' reckless gamble. They called it preserving the bloodline's purity, but in truth, they were spinning a deadly wheel of genetic fate, marrying cousins to cousins, uncles to nieces, until their family tree twisted into a knot of ruin. The Habsburgs' obsession with pure blood was no mere tradition. It was a dangerous fixation that turned their lineage into a genetic trap. To keep power tightly within the family, they wove a web of marriages so entangled that Charles II's ancestry resembled a maze. His parents, uncle and niece, his grandparents. The same twisted pairing on both sides. Trace his bloodline back, and you'd find a family so inbred that Charles was practically his own cousin over and over again. The result was a king whose very existence screamed the consequences of their hubris. This wasn't just a matter of a malformed jaw, it was a body betraying its own design. Charles's mandibular deformity, what history dubs the Habsburg jaw, was so severe that his teeth refused to align. A gap wide enough for a coin persisted even when he tried to shut his mouth. Chewing. Impossible. Every meal was a humiliating ordeal. Palace cooks reduced his food to infant-like mush, pureed, mashed, or liquid. Yet even this couldn't spare him. Soup dribbled from his lips, and morsels of food simply fell away. Royal banquets, meant to dazzle with splendor, became grim spectacles. Servants hovered, wiping saliva from their king's chin as he struggled through each bite, his dignity crumbling with every messy spoonful. The Habsburg jaw didn't just rob Charles II of the ability to eat like a king. It silenced his voice. His grotesquely protruding lower jaw mangled his speech, turning every word into a slurred, wet mumble. Even his own courtiers strained to decipher his royal decrees, and foreign diplomats often needed interpreters, not for language, but to make sense of the garbled sounds spilling from their monarch's mouth. The most powerful ruler in Europe, commanding a global empire, was reduced to a figure whose words barely carried beyond the palace walls. The horror didn't end there. Charles's mother, Queen Mariana, lived in constant dread, haunted by a chilling fear that her son might choke on his own tongue in his sleep. Palace records reveal her anguished letters, confessing her terror that the king, already a prisoner of his malformed body, could suffocate under the weight of his own flesh. This wasn't mere paranoia. The deformity that twisted his jaw made every breath a gamble. Yet the Habsburgs, fully aware that their incestuous unions were spawning increasingly broken heirs, pressed on. To them, the agony of their children was a small price to pay for an iron grip on power. Charles wasn't bewitched by demons. He was the living wreckage of a dynasty that chose ambition over humanity. A king whose every labored word whispered of their fatal arrogance. Charles II's jaw was merely the beginning of a body so warped it seemed to defy the laws of nature. At 35, the King of Spain looked less like a monarch in his prime and more like a frail child, stretched and twisted by some merciless force. Barely reaching 5 feet, his proportions were a mockery of human form, a massive head teetered on a neck too weak to hold it, while his skeletal limbs and hunched torso gave him the appearance of carrying an unseen weight. His spine, cruelly curved, forced him into a permanent stoop, as if bowing to the burden of his cursed lineage. Walking was a triumph he didn't achieve until age 8, years after most children take their first steps. Even then, it was no victory. Palace chronicles describe Charles lurching through halls, clinging to furniture like an old man, his shuffle a pitiful contrast to the majesty expected of a king. The Habsburgs' relentless inbreeding had sculpted a ruler whose body was a living ruin, a testament to their obsession with power over nature. Every step he took, every labored breath, was a reminder of a dynasty that gambled with genetics and lost spectacularly. Charles II's body was a wreck, but his mind bore wounds just as deep, carved by the same genetic curse that twisted his frame. Well into adulthood, the King of Spain possessed the intellect of a child, struggling to grasp even the simplest concepts. He didn't learn to read until he was 10, and even then, comprehension eluded him. Court tutors, tasked with shaping a monarch, likened their efforts to pouring water into a shattered cup. Knowledge slipped through the cracks of his broken mind. His emotional state was no less fragile, swinging wildly between childish tantrums and eerie, vacant silences. Palace servants whispered of violent outbursts over trivial slights, where Charles would scream and thrash like a toddler denied a toy. These fits gave way to haunting periods of withdrawal, hours spent staring blankly, unresponsive to the world around him. His patchy, thinning hair, falling out in clumps, only added to the grotesque image. A scalp more akin to a diseased creature's hide than a king's crown. Court painters, desperate to preserve his dignity, took liberties in portraits. But no brush could mask the truth. Charles was a monarch unraveling, his mind and body crumbling under the weight of a dynasty's reckless ambition, a living warning of what happens when bloodlines are pushed to the brink. As Charles II aged, his body didn't merely weaken, it disintegrated as if his very existence was unraveling. By his 30s, the King of Spain was a walking paradox. A monarch in his supposed prime who seemed to age backward, his frail form deteriorating faster than time could explain. His skeletal frame grew more brittle, his hunched silhouette more pronounced, as though his body were collapsing under the weight of centuries of Habsburg inbreeding. Doctors of the era, baffled by his condition, could only watch as their king's health spiraled into a nightmare no medicine could cure. What made this tragedy even more chilling was the Habsburgs' willful blindness. They knew their tangled web of cousin marriages was spawning deformed heirs, yet they pressed on, prioritizing power over the suffering of their own kin. Charles wasn't just a victim of biology. He was a living experiment gone horribly wrong. His every labored step a testament to a dynasty that valued control over compassion. His worsening condition wasn't a mystery. It was the inevitable result of a family that gambled with nature and lost, leaving their king to decay before the eyes of a horrified court. The greatest tragedy of Charles II's reign wasn't just his broken body, it was his inability to secure the future of his dynasty. The Spanish throne, a pillar of European power, rested on a king who could not produce an heir. His first marriage to Marie-Louise of Orléans was a union steeped in hope but doomed from the start. The young French princess arrived expecting a regal husband, only to find a man barely clinging to life. Their wedding night was a disaster, leaving Marie-Louise in tears and Charles bewildered, his body betraying him in the most intimate of royal duties. The court, desperate to preserve the Habsburg line, refused to face the truth. Charles's genetic ruin had left him functionally impotent, his reproductive organs described as infantile. Instead, they pointed fingers at Marie-Louise, branding her barren. She endured humiliating examinations, forced to swallow vile herbal brews and undergo painful treatments, all while the court ignored the real issue: her husband's biological incapacity. The pressure crushed her spirit. Once vibrant, she withered into despair, her days spent in futile prayers for a miracle that could never come. When she died at 26 under mysterious circumstances, whispers of poison swirled, a grim hint that her ordeal may have been more than just emotional torment. Charles's second marriage to Maria Anna of Neuburg fared no better, as the court's desperation only deepened, setting the stage for a looming catastrophe that would shake Europe to its core. With Charles II's second marriage to Maria Anna of Neuburg proving as fruitless as the first, the Spanish court's desperation reached a fever pitch. The king, now in his 30s and frailer than ever, was a walking symbol of a dynasty teetering on collapse. His body, ravaged by genetic flaws, could not fulfill the most basic duty of a monarch: to sire an heir. Maria Anna, horrified by her husband's worsening condition, penned private letters confessing her dread, realizing that no child would ever come from their union. Yet the court, unwilling to admit their king's biological failure, turned to increasingly frantic measures. Europe watched with bated breath, knowing Charles's death without an heir would ignite a power struggle of catastrophic proportions. The Habsburgs' centuries-long quest to hoard power through inbreeding had backfired spectacularly. Leaving their empire vulnerable, doctors from across the continent were summoned, ancient texts consulted, even mystical remedies attempted, all in vain. Charles endured humiliating examinations, his dignity stripped, as physicians prodded his underdeveloped body for answers they could never find. Meanwhile, diplomatic circles buzzed with tension. Every major power, France, Austria, England, had claims to the Spanish throne, their armies poised for the inevitable clash. The War of Spanish Succession loomed like a storm cloud, ready to erupt the moment Charles's faltering heart gave out, threatening to drown Europe in blood over a dynasty's fatal obsession. When science failed to save Charles II, the Spanish court turned to the supernatural, plunging into a realm of madness and terror. Convinced their king was possessed, they summoned Father Fray Landers, the court's chief exorcist, who declared Charles tormented by a host of demons. What followed was a spectacle as horrifying as it was bizarre. Public exorcisms staged in the royal throne room itself. Nobles and dignitaries watched aghast as their monarch writhed on the floor, priests chanting Latin prayers over his convulsing form, their voices echoing through the gilded halls. These were no quiet rituals. Father Landers forced Charles to drink foul concoctions of holy water laced with ground-up relics, triggering violent illness, vomiting, shaking, even fainting, interpreted as demons fleeing his body. Priests pressed crucifixes against his skin until he screamed, doused him with sacred water, and demanded he recite prayers he could scarcely understand. In 1698, the madness escalated. Landers ordered a palace-wide purge, burning furniture, royal gifts, and even past queen's belongings in towering courtyard bonfires, claiming they harbored witchcraft. Most chilling of all, Charles, his mind frail and suggestible, believed the exorcisms worked, begging for more when his pain flared. By 1699, Landers claimed to have banished 47 named demons, leaving the king so exhausted he collapsed, silent for days. These torturous rituals, cloaked as salvation, only hastened the decline of a man already broken by his own bloodline. When Charles II died in 1700, at the age of 38, the Spanish court braced for the truth they had long dreaded. The autopsy, conducted by Dr. Geronimo de la Fuente Pierola, unveiled a body so ravaged it seemed more monstrous than human. His heart, no bigger than a walnut, was shriveled and blackened, barely capable of sustaining life. His lungs, corroded and filled with putrid fluid, reeked so foully that assistants fled the room. His intestines were rotting inside him, and his reproductive organs, source of a dynasty's despair, were pitifully underdeveloped. Most hauntingly, his skull revealed a brain drowned in fluid, its tissue discolored and damaged, explaining his childlike mind and erratic behavior. Dr. Pierola's report, initially suppressed for its horror, declared it a miracle Charles had lived so long, as not a single organ was healthy. These findings, far from dispelling supernatural fears, fueled them. How could a man survive such ruin unless dark forces were at play? Yet the true curse was no demon. It was the Habsburgs' obsession with blood purity, a centuries-long gamble that birthed a king whose every breath was a defiance of his crumbling biology. Charles's death without an heir unleashed the War of Spanish Succession, a brutal conflict that claimed countless lives and redrew Europe's map. The irony is stark. A dynasty that hoarded power through inbreeding lost everything. Their final king, a tragic symbol of biology's revenge. His story stands as a chilling reminder that the greatest threat to absolute power isn't rebellion or invasion. It's the silent ruin of a tainted bloodline.